com inovações para todas as escolas do Brasil. Sejam bem-vindos ao EDUCA Week 2020.
Olá, pessoal, bom dia, sejam todos bem-vindos. Agradeço a todos que nos acompanham ao vivo. Para dar início ao painel Educando para o Futuro dos Alunos e não Nosso Passado, gostaria de convidar a mediadora desta conversa, Ana Maria Diniz, presidente do Conselho do Instituto Península. Bom dia, Ana Maria, seja bem-vinda.
Bom dia, Marcos. Um prazer estar com vocês aqui no EDUCA Week, nesse painel tão importante com a Andrea Schlescher, para falar de um momento tão crítico que nós estamos passando, né, e com impactos enormes para a educação, para entender e um pouco mais fundo o que a gente pode fazer como país para sair do outro lado de um jeito mais virtuoso. Obrigada pela oportunidade.
Imagina. Vamos dar início à palestra exclusiva que o senhor André Schleicher fez para o EDUCA Week, que foi legendada, e também entraremos ao vivo com o senhor Schleicher após o momento da palestra no EDUCA Week. Então, voltamos com o Schleicher em alguns minutos.
Hello, I'm delighted to join you for the EDUCA Week right here in Brazil. These are difficult times for education, not just in Brazil, but worldwide. School closures have deeply disrupted our way of providing education. But it's also an opportunity to think afresh about the future of education. But first of the crisis, you can see 1.6 billion students being out of school, on their own devices to learn. Remote learning that used to be nice to have has become the lifeline for education. But it is good as it can be for the delivery of instruction. It doesn't replace the social functions of schools that are very important. We also see that access, use, and the quality of online resources tend to amplify educational disparities. Those students from wealthy backgrounds who have access to the technology, who have parents who push them to study hard, who have the motivation and resilience to learn on their own, will be fine. Maybe this environment is liberating and exciting for them. But those young people who do not have the parental support, access to the right technology, or who have, just been spoon-fed by their teachers, never to learn to study on their own, they're suddenly thrown into very difficult circumstances. Accreditation is at stake. Now, how do we do exams in this situation? How do we give young people the confidence and the accreditation that they can use to show employers what they have learned? There are clearly huge just-in-time needs for professional development. Teachers suddenly need to embrace entirely new pedagogical practice, find new ways to reach their students. And they couldn't have been possibly prepared for this. There are also very difficult curricular choices. Now, when instruction time is limited, maybe 40% of original time, we need to think much harder about what we should be teaching. Should we focus on those essential, the fundamentals that will have reading, mathematics, science, that will help young people sort of to succeed on exams, be prepared? Or do we realize that this crisis actually commands a much wider range of cognitive, social, and emotional qualities, capabilities for student success? Very difficult choices. We can make them at the system level, or we can put that on the shoulders of teachers and schools. But despite all of those difficulties, there are also lots of really innovative educational solutions emerging. Some technology-based, some not. This is the challenge in which we are, but let's look at, despite this current challenge, that's the evolution of education more generally. We started assessing learning outcomes through PISA in the year 2000. And that was a very different world back then. Reading was mainly about, reading books, printed text, linear text. material that had been carefully authored. When you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia. You could trust the answer to be true. And today, reading is mainly online from all sorts of sources. When you don't know the answer to a question, you look it up on Google and you will find 30,000 answers to your question. And nobody will tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer just about extracting knowledge from prefabricated sources, carefully authored, carefully proved. Literacy is about creating knowledge, navigating ambiguity, distinguishing fact from opinion. And you can see, actually, it was the year 2003 when we did our second assessment that technology began to emerge. In 2006, when we did our third assessment, that was the year before the iPhone was invented. Twitter was still a sound. The Amazon used to be still a river. But what you can see is when you look at the OECD average score on PISA, it's basically the average of the countries taking part in the OECD on this assessment, you can see it's barely moved. A rapidly changing world, and we cannot see much change in learning outcomes. And then think about 2009. There was a time when social media emerged. We started to talk with our computers. Or 2012, suddenly you can see robotics, cloud computing, big data, biogenetics, huge changes in science and technology, changing the world around us, changing the nature of reading. And now in the last few years, artificial intelligence is fundamentally transforming the way we interact with information. Algorithms become very powerful in shaping our ways of thinking, our ways of working. But what you can see over time is that we have barely seen any change in the quality of literacy skills for young people at the age of 50. This is when we test this PISA. A rapidly changing world, very little change in education. If you would see a line like this on a brain scan, you would get very worried. And that's despite the fact that, we tend to put more resources in education. Now, that's the average picture. At the very same time, some systems have improved. But before I talk about this, I want to just highlight one figure. On average, across the countries for which you have data, just 1 in 10 can distinguish between fact and opinion. Now, you could say that's better than in the year 2000 when it was 7%. But again, we live in a totally different world. And you look to a country like Brazil, it's between 1 and 2% of young people capable to navigate the information sources, albeit in quite complex context, I admit that. But again, we did see progress in some countries. If you look to the 4 Chinese provinces that took part in the PISA assessment, I can barely fit them on the screen here. If I look at this, Singapore, moving from good to great. Among the OECD countries, Estonia, dramatic progress. And it's in the European terms, a rather poor country, spends 30% less on education per student than the average in the European Union. So some countries are progressing. If you think about Portugal in Europe, a steady progress, despite being badly hit by a financial crisis around 2008, 2009. Poland, another of those education systems that has seen steep progress. Now, if you look at among the countries still with very basic skills, you can look at Peru or Albania. Also there, we have seen really, really good progress. And then, of course, Brazil is an example too. Maybe the improvement has not been that impressive, but you think about it. In the year 2000, just half, a little bit more than half of 15-year-olds were enrolled in school. In the year 2018, it was 65%. So Brazil actually shows the world you can actually add more people to the system and still improve the learning outcomes. And you can see the same in a country like Turkey. So these are quite encouraging results. It suggests that we can actually change things. And I think, again, Brazil is a good example. And that, brings us to this. You can see a country like Sweden that used to be, the gold star in education, doing really, really well. Everybody was looking to Sweden. And then, it declined and declined and declined in the 2000s. But in 2012, it caught the ball, changed things, improved things. And you can see performance rising again. This shows us actually that we can change things, and I think that's very important. And that gets us to the list of countries that you find on the PISA league tables. Some doing really, really well, some doing so-and-so, some having a lot of room for improvement. Some say, well, if I want to improve outcomes, I just need to add more time to the system. Students just don't have enough time to read, to do math, and to science, and so on. And you can see in this chart, there are huge differences among countries in the time that students spend learning. You look at the United Arab Emirates. Students spend close to 60 hours learning per week. Some of that in school, marked here in blue, and some of that out of school, homework, private tutoring, lots of things marked here in yellow. A lot of time going into learning. But then you look on the left side to a country like Finland, you have only about 35 hours per week. Just a little bit more than half of the time that students in the UAE spend learning. Huge differences in the volume of learning time. But when you look at productivity, you can see students in Finland learn a lot in very little time, whereas students in the United Arab Emirates spend a lot of time and learn rather little. The point I make is not just about the volume of learning time, it's the quality of the instructional system, quality of pedagogy, the quality of teaching. All of those factors are shaping learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are always the product of the quantity of time, the hours that we spend, and the quality of instruction. And we need to look harder at productivity. So learning time alone is not a great predictor for better learning outcomes. Now, what is a good, and Brazil is also a good example. Brazil is not so much an issue of lack of learning time, but more an issue of raising productivity in education. Now, learning time is not a great predictor. Here is a great predictor of learning outcomes. On the horizontal axis, I show you the growth mindset of students. That's basically where students take ownership of their learning, where they believe they can change things. Their success depends on their effort rather than just on inherited intelligence. On the vertical axis, you see the performance of an education system. And you can see the relationship among the two is not perfect, but it's pretty robust, where students take more ownership in their learning, where they believe that they can succeed because of their own effort rather than, because success is about inherited intelligence. They tend to do better. Look at Estonia, #1 in the OECD on growth mindset, #1 in the OECD among performance. Indonesia, on the other hand, has to go a long way on both things. Brazil is sort of a little bit of an outlier. Students actually are quite optimistic about their capability to succeed and to harvest effort. At the same time, they still have more to go when it comes to actually improving outcomes. But overall, that relationship is quite robust. We also see where students have a stronger growth mindset, they seem to be more likely to be motivated to master difficult tasks. They have a greater sense of self-efficacy, less fear of failure. But think about this. If you want your students to be creative, imaginative, they'll have to experiment. If they experiment, they take risks. If they take risks, they're likely to make mistakes. If they're afraid of mistakes, if our systems are not very good to support students to learn from and with mistakes, they're not being so successful. Students with a stronger growth mindset are also more likely to set ambitious learning goals and actually see more of the value of schools. So those things are really, really important. And let's talk even one step further away from the academic outcomes, life satisfaction. You can see on this chart that students in some countries are very happy with their lives. Now, on the left side, on the right side, students are less satisfied with their lives. And that's, of course, also a very important outcome of education. And you can see some of the highest performing education system. Look to Korea, look to Hong Kong, or the 4 provinces in mainland China. Students do really, really well academically and are not happy with their lives. Now, when you look at this, you might think, well, maybe there's a trade-off. If you want students to study hard, to push a lot of pressure on them, you have them succeed well, they become very unhappy with their lives. But then, you see other countries. Look at the Netherlands, look at Finland, look at Switzerland, look at Estonia. The students do rather well on the PISA assessment, and they also are satisfied with their lives. And when you look at what predicts life satisfaction, you can see it's to do with good teacher support, with good parental support, students socializing at school, and also students engaging in more physical activity. And when you think about what predicts poor life satisfaction, it's things like anxiety with schoolwork and also extreme internet use. So once again, we have to look at a broader range of outcomes. Now, of course, the question is, how do we get there? How do we actually advance the education systems? Some say, life satisfaction is something about, your friends, your parents, your families, the environment in which you live. But look at this chart. School has a lot to do with the extent to which students are happy with their lives. The disciplinary climate in the classroom. Is there a productive way of learning? Is a good predictor of students' life satisfaction. Absence of bullying, quite understandably. The sense of belonging. Do students feel that school is a place where they belong, where they make friends, where they have teachers who relate with them? Teacher support in itself, the teacher feedback, the extent to which teachers relate to students, provide productive feedback. All of those factors are not just important for academic learning, they seem to be also correlated with whether students are happy with their lives. And then you look at student collaboration, cooperation, also that a good predictor of students' life satisfaction. Why I'm telling you this, that school is not just about learning, school has a lot to do with the future of people. And if you think about, how do we move to the future? In the past, it was just about teaching young people something. But the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, have also become easy to digitize, to automate, to outsource. Student success is no longer about, routine cognitive skills. It's about enabling students to develop complex ways of thinking, complex ways of working. I'm going to talk about this in more detail in a moment. In the past, only some students needed to succeed. Today, everybody needs to succeed. Education used to be about sorting people. Now it's about developing talent, ensuring that extraordinary talents are developed among ordinary students, understanding how different students learn differently and embracing that diversity with differentiated pedagogical practice, sometimes amplified by technology. And of course, that commands a very different caliber of teachers. In the past, we told our teachers exactly what to teach and how to teach with very prescriptive, narrow environments. Today, it's about, enabling teachers to become creative designers of innovative learning environments, to take professional ownership, to work as high-level professional knowledge workers. And of course, those people don't like to work in factories, the kind of tayloristic industrial work environments that we have created in our schools. They prefer flat, collegial, entrepreneurial school environments. And they don't want to just, feed information upward in the system. They want to be connected to their next teacher, their next school, maybe their next education system. These are the challenges of transformation that lie ahead of us, not just in this current crisis, but much more generally. Let's talk about them in greater detail. Now, how do we move away from a system where, we just reproduce knowledge towards imaginative, creating knowledge, having students think for themselves and work with others? In a way, our education systems have become very good at educating second-class robots, people who are very good to repeat what we tell them. In this time of artificial intelligence, we need to think much harder about what makes us human. Those are the questions that are in front of education systems. Now, once again, you can see on this chart that the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, have also become easy to digitize, to automate, to outsource. The steepest decline in the demand of skills in our societies is not about, manual work anymore. It's about routine cognitive skills. In turn, we're seeing a rise in the capacity of non-routine analytic skills, the capacity of young people not to reproduce what they learn, but to extrapolate from what they know and to apply their knowledge in novel situations. And look at the green line, social skills, capacity of people to connect, to collaborate, to commit. All of this are becoming increasingly important. And that has a lot to do with digitalization. Think about it. Technology has been incredibly democratizing. Everybody can contribute, everybody can collaborate, everybody can plug into this digital connected world. But technology has also been incredibly concentrating power. Think about the big tech companies that actually control a lot of our lives and our work. Technology has been incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard anywhere. But it's also been incredibly homogenizing, often squashing individuality and cultural uniqueness. Questions around identity, agency are at the forefront of education these days. Technology has been incredibly empowering. You can see that right here in Brazil. The most successful companies are no longer created by a big industry, but by a big idea. They have the product before they have the money. But technology can also be incredibly disempowering. When we become the slaves of algorithms that tell us whether to turn left or right, or the fitness computer that tells us whether we are healthy, we are losing many human capabilities because we put them in the hands of technological devices. And where we end up on this chart has a lot to do with doing its core. Let's think about this in more detail now. If you think about the time before the first industrial revolution, neither technology nor education were very important for the vast majority of people. But the first industrial revolution changed everything. It put technology ahead of people and caused huge amount of social pain. A lot of people were left out of the equation. They were not ready in this industrial world. But there was also the time when, we invented universal schooling, putting people into institutions, making them compatible with the ways of thinking of the industry. Basically, making people compatible with, standardized work, to have basic kind of knowledge, to come on time to work and things like this. And that created generations of prosperity. But if we're honest, we have not seen real transformation in our education system since those times. And now we have the digital revolution, doing all of this again, moving technology ahead of the capabilities of people, and again, creating huge amount of social pain. Look at Brazil. You have university students having difficulties finding a good job, and at the same time, employers who say they cannot find the people with the skills they need. We need to close that gap. We need to once again, move people ahead of the technologies of our times. That's the task at hand for education now. Again, we have this rapidly expanding scope of knowledge. But what makes humans special is the realm of human knowledge, the realm of ethics and good judgment. Artificial intelligence is amazing. It's an amazing accelerator, an amazing amplifier of whatever we do. But it can amplify and accelerate good ideas and good practice in the same way as it can amplify bad ideas and bad practice. That makes it so much more important that people can make authoritative judgment, that they can navigate ambiguity. The realm of creativity, aesthetics, and design. The capacity to imagine, to create, to build something of intrinsic positive worth. That is what differentiates us from technologies. The realm of natural and physical health, the realm of political and civic life. Bridging social capital, our capacity to see the world through different lenses and perspectives, appreciate different ways of thinking, different ways of working, understanding how other people work and think. Those are the challenges ahead of this. Of course, knowledge is always going to be central to this. But perhaps we should worry less about disciplinary knowledge, biology, chemistry, physics, and worry more about epistemic understanding. Can you think like a scientist? Can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from questions that are not? Those fundamental capabilities are important. History is not just about names and places and times. It's about our capacity to understand how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and why and how it unraveled when the context changed. What does it mean for the time in which we live? Can you think like a mathematician? We teach young people to calculate an exponential function. But do we really understand the nature of an exponential function? As humans, we are built for linear spaces. Time is linear, space is linear. We actually have a hard time to capture the nature of an exponential function. In fact, if we did, we would have probably dealt with the coronavirus in very different ways than we have actually done so. If we can teach young people the foundations of the academic disciplines rather than just the surface knowledge, we're going to equip them much better to accumulate and develop the knowledge they need when they need it. If we just, teach at the surface without those foundations, students are going to get lost when the context and the content will change. And if we're honest, Brazil is no exception. Our school systems have become a mile wide and an inch deep. We teach a lot of things at very shallow depths. How can I say that? Look at the Brazilian PISA results. Students are actually quite good when they were confronted with relatively shallow, narrow tasks. They could answer them. But the moment students had to solve a complex problem or apply a concept in a different context, or to think across the boundaries of subject disciplines, that great difficulties now. Maybe the future of education is about teaching fewer things at greater depths. And once again, the world no longer rewards us just for what we know. Now, Google knows everything. The world rewards us for what we can do with what we know. Skills. When you think about skills, the first thought is about often creative skills, critical thinking skills, and they're very important. But at least equally important are the social and emotional capabilities of people. That's where actually we make the biggest difference in the world of today. And actually, we started to collect some data on this. If you think about classroom climate, now the first thought you have is about, discipline, is about, classroom structure, classroom organization, things like this. But look at this chart. You can see actually classroom climate is very strongly predicted, by the sense of cooperation that students have, the sense of self-efficacy, the curiosity, the optimism, the trust, tolerance, and so on. Many social and emotional dimensions actually are very powerful forces relating to the classroom climate. When you think about, bullying in school, also that, you can combat bullying with many policies and practices, making everybody aware, ensuring that there's no tolerance, all sorts of things. But once again, the social emotional capabilities and dispositions of young people are a very strong predictor for school bullying. What is also important that, what we learn different things best at different stages of our lives. When we talk about social emotional skills, for example, emotional control is something so important. We learn that best between, the ages of 0 and 3, well before we think about schooling even. In fact, later on, some of those social emotional skills become, personality traits or character qualities. It's very hard to change them. Early in life, they are skills. Think about language. We often teach people foreign language in secondary school, a lesson on Monday and another lesson on Thursday. Well, the problem is that's almost the only way in which the brain does not accumulate learning about foreign languages. If we wanted to be successful, we would, embed, foreign language teaching in a sports class in kindergarten or primary school. Neuroscience tells us a lot, and often our school systems are, organized around the habits of governments and people and adults, rather than about what we know about the nature of learning. We need to become better at that and embed that in our instructional system. Now, if you would ask me, what are the most transformative competencies in tomorrow's world? Here's my list, and this is a list that we developed with hundreds of experts from very different fields through our Education 2030 project. The first, not surprisingly, is our capacity to create new value, to build something of intrinsic positive worth. That's the biggest differentiator to technology. I said it already. Our capacity to navigate ambiguity, to manage and resolve tensions and dilemmas, to understand and resolve and moderate conflicts, and to take responsibility to mobilize our cognitive, social, emotional resources to do something. Many times in life, we know what to do. Many times, we are capable of doing something, and we are still not taking action. That kind of initiative is very, very important. If you think about the kind of pedagogies around this, the first point I want to make is about openness, anticipation. Our school systems are very, very good in transmitting the established wisdom of our times. They're far less good in helping young people question the established wisdom of our times. Being open to the novelty, being ready to see when there is need for something new. Learning is the easy part. Much harder in life is our capacity to unlearn and to relearn when the context changes. Our ability to reflect, to step back, to see the bigger picture, to see the forest among the trees. Also, that is of crucial importance. And then again, taking action, giving students space to develop agency and co-agency. It's not just about what I do, it's about what can I do with others. If I take some lessons from this, of course, it's to do with rigor, focus, and coherence. Rigor is about cognitive demand, creating learning environments that are capturing the imagination of students, their interest, their engagement. Focus, teaching fewer things at greater depths. And coherence, creating meaningful learning progressions. Success is about remaining true to the disciplines, but aiming at disciplinary learning and the capacity of students to see problems through multiple disciplinary lenses. To focus on areas with the highest transfer value, where students can extrapolate, apply their knowledge, use it in other contexts. Having problems that are thematic, problem-based, project-based, that are co-created in conversation. And remember, many things in education are core, not taught, particularly when it comes to social emotional skills. Long story, but very, very important. But let's get to the second dimension. How do we get from education systems that are just sorting people to education systems that are really, really good at capturing the potential of every learner? I want to bring you back once more to the PISA results. Here, I show you for one country, and I take the Slovak Republic here, the gap between the students from the most disadvantaged and the most privileged students. Think about this. You take the Slovak Republic, an average performer on PISA, the students from the poorest neighborhoods do, very, very poorly among the poorest performing countries, and the students from the wealthiest neighborhoods, they can compare themselves with Estonia, with Hong Kong, and so on. Some people say that's inevitable. Poverty is destiny. If you come from a disadvantaged background, you don't have the resources, don't have the time, you don't have the means to be good in education. But, compare that with Portugal. The 10% most disadvantaged students in Portugal are almost as good as the average student in Slovenia. And if you look at the Chinese students, the Chinese from the 4 provinces, you can see the 10% most disadvantaged students in these provinces are almost as good as the students from the wealthiest backgrounds in the Slovak Republic. So you can see poverty need not be destiny. Some students, in some countries, students from all social backgrounds achieve excellent learning outcomes. So we can do much better in leveling the playing field. This is about social background. You can do the same story about, geography. If you see in the case of Finland, only 5% of the performance variation among students lies between schools. The closest school is always the best school. There's no variability. You don't have to worry about school choice as a parent. Every school achieves high performance. You look at the other extreme, you look at Israel, you can see almost half of the variability lies between schools. The kind of school you choose for your child has a huge influence on the quality of learning. And most countries are in the middle of that. Now, Brazil also sort of so-so, but still a lot of variability lies between schools. So a lot of hard work in front of Brazil to level the playing field, to ensure that Brazil attracts the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms, to make sure that every student has access to excellent teaching. And you can see that in this chart. Now, ideally, you would like to be in the green area, where basically there's a good match between resources and needs, where systems are capable to add resources where they are most needed to attract talented school leaders and teachers into challenging environments. But you look to Brazil, particularly when it comes to educational material. If you go to a disadvantaged neighborhood, your school is going to be less supplied, will have fewer educational resources, poor equipment, poor technology, and also often the less qualified teachers. This is a challenge, not just for Brazil. You can see Brazil is not alone on this. But I mean, closing the gap, matching resources with needs is a huge educational challenge. And again, that actually has a lot to do with the growth mindset of students. You can see that here, where students are growing up with this idea that they can own their learning, that success is about hard work and effort rather than talent. They were much more likely to overcome social disadvantage. And that's particularly true for Brazil. You can see Brazil has one of the longest bars on this chart. Let me move to the third challenge. How can we strengthen professionalism in education? Moving from just looking upwards in the bureaucracy to looking upwards to the next teacher, to the next school, to the next education system. Let me just highlight a couple of points. Teacher professionalism has to do with three aspects. It has to do, of course, with the knowledge that teachers have. What do teachers know about the subject they teach? Do they have really, that passion for the subject, which students will, realize in the very first lesson? What do teachers know about how different students learn that subject differently? But also, and that's often forgotten, what do teachers actually know about their students as people, their dreams, their aspirations, their wishes? If you are a teacher in Brazil, you spend a lot of time in the classroom teaching. You actually have much less time for working with students out of the classroom setting, working with their parents, families. This is very different in Japan or China or Finland, where actually teachers spend a lot of their time working with individual students, working with each other to develop new pedagogical practice. They teach less, work more. So that's about, the knowledge. But the second part, equally important, is the discretion that teachers have to design innovative learning environments that are right to their students' professional autonomy. And the third aspect is to do with the collaborative culture in schools. To what extent do teachers, work together to share good practice? If you look, for example, just at this last aspect, teacher-professional collaboration. Teachers in Brazil are very social people. They work a lot together. But when you actually study in more detail how they work, you can see actually, yes, they discuss individual students' results, they share resources, they collaborate for common standards and so on. But when you actually get to the deeper layers of collaboration, classroom observation, studying what other teachers do, how other teachers work, is almost non-existing in Brazil. Joint activities, collaborative professional development, team teaching, relatively rare. Why do I highlight this? Because what our data actually show is that the more teachers teach jointly as a team, the more they observe other teachers' classes and provide feedback, the more they engage in joint activities across different classes or take part in collaborative professional learning, the greater their sense of self-efficacy. And of course, teachers who have stronger self-efficacy are much better predicated to actually also deploy strong pedagogical practice. In fact, you can do the same about job satisfaction. If you think about job satisfaction, yeah, it has to do something with salaries, working conditions. But look, what actually shapes job satisfaction most is teacher professionalism, teacher knowledge, teacher professional collaboration, teacher professional autonomy. Those are the biggest predictors that we have in our data set for people being satisfied with their job, being satisfied with their work environment. These are actually better predictor than things like class size or teacher salaries. So strengthening professionalism is one of the sources for actually strengthening the esteem of teachers. You can see that even the status of the teaching profession as perceived by teachers is closely related to this. So this is one of the pathways how we can raise the status of the teaching profession. How do we move away from prescription to a much more dynamic environment with greater ownership of professional practices? One of the things that we can see actually is that in some countries, look here at the Netherlands, almost all decisions about education are made at this level of the school. Schools have an enormous range of responsibility. If I look to Turkey and Greece, basically schools have almost no role in the education system. Finland is interesting. You don't make decisions on your own. You always make decisions in consultation, collaboration with a higher level of authority. It's a very kind of collaborative environment. But what I wanted to show you simply is the role of school, the school influence on their learning environment varies hugely across countries. And actually, our data show that it can make a difference. Now, there was a strong correlation between the responsibilities that school leaders and teachers have for the way they manage resources, they design the curriculum, they influence disciplinary climate, assessment policies, admission policies, and learning outcomes. So again, strengthening professional autonomy and a collaborative culture seems to be one of the pathways that successful education systems pursue. The past was divided, teachers and content were divided by subjects and student destinations, and schools are usually very good to keep students inside and the rest of the world outside. When we think about the future, we need to look at much more integrated learning environments, integration of subjects, integration of students, integration of learning context, and also connect learning better with real-world context. Learning that is less subject-based, more project-based. And that level of integration is really hard because it's not about asking teachers to mix up everything. It's about getting the mathematics teacher, the history teacher, the sports teacher to work much more closely together to design more coherent learning environments. And also parents, last but not least, you can see actually, where parents were interested in the students' school activities. According to the students were more likely to be ambitious, to be happier with their lives, and to feel less lonely. So again, getting parents on board. Good education is always about everybody's business, building bridges. And that's once again something that, a country like Brazil can learn from countries like Vietnam or China, where actually that social fabric is very, very strong. If you are a parent, you would get every day, some pictures from your classroom of your children. You can kind of participate in what the children do, and so on. So technology is being levered to actually build close connections. And last but not least, success is also about making policies very coherent and well aligned. It's very hard to do. We often do things and then we do tomorrow something else, and then people lose trust in whatever we have done. Aligning policies over consistent and coherent periods of time is something that we can learn from successful education systems. Where, if you are a ruling party in 1 year, you didn't engage in designing a policy if you wouldn't trust that, the next party, the next government is going to carry this forward. So you always keep an open mind. You negotiate, you discuss the policies, and you discuss them with the profession. Now, if you do not engage teachers in the design of policy and practice, they're not going to help you with implementing policy and practice. So those things are really, really important. And that's really hard. I acknowledge this. Changing education can be like moving graveyards. You cannot rely on the people sometimes who are out there. The status quo has just many protectors. That's the reality. And sometimes we as parents are, part of the problem, not part of the solution. We get so anxious when our children no longer learn what was very important to us, or when they do learn things that we no longer understand. Teachers are often more likely to teach how they were taught than how they were taught to teach. And as a policymaker, you can lose an election over education, but you rarely win an election over education because it just takes a lot of time to translate good ideas into better outcomes. These things are really, really hard. We have also complex governance structures. You think about Brazil, you have the federal government, the state government, the schools, and all of that needs to be orchestrated. We often don't have the kind of supportive ecosystems that other fields of public policy can draw on. The health sector has a huge industry out there. In education, we often, artisan. In medicine, you would never ask, a doctor to invent their own medicine. They can rely on those kinds of resources. In education, we need to do those things. This is really, really hard. And, making change happen is easy to talk about. The kind of things I talked about is very hard to make them happen. Only few countries really succeed. The road of education reform is simply littered with many good ideas that were poorly implemented. That's where we need to do better. And the real obstacle to education reform is not often conservative followers, but conservative leaders. No? Don't ask yourself how many teachers follow your own ideas as a policymaker or a school leader. Ask yourself how well your teachers can collaborate among themselves. And programs, ideas never scale. It's always culture that scales. And culture is always the hallmark of effective leadership. Culture is about system learning. It's about system-wide innovation. It's about purposeful collaboration. Those are the things we need to think harder about. The laws, regulations, structures, and institutions are often just a small, visible tip of a huge iceberg. As education leaders, we're rarely successful unless we can build a shared understanding, bring people on board, engage the profession, create true professional ownership. Engaging stakeholders is so crucial. Carefully piloting the ideas that we have, making sure that our ideas are backed up with sustainable resources. And that's not just money, it's most importantly capacity in the system. Time our ideas very carefully. And then, last but not least, looking outward. Education leaders need not just to look forward, but also outwards. That's not about copying and pasting solutions from other places. It's about looking seriously and dispassionately at good practice in our own countries, but also elsewhere, to understand what works in what context. School systems that feel threatened by alternative ways of thinking, they get often trapped in old practice, in bad practice. The ones that progress, that are the ones that are open to the world, that look outwards, that are ready to learn from and with the world's education leaders. Thank you very much.
To have a better education. Here in this conversation is also Ana Maria Diniz. She is president of Peninsula Institute. Hello.
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 Thank you to Marcos and all the organization. Thank you to education. It's a pleasure for me to mediate this panel. I hope it works and it helps us here in Brazil with some lights to improve our education. Thank you. So can I start with the first question?
Posso fazer a pergunta?
We are living the most serious crisis of our generation
A maior
with unpredicted outcomes. During the pandemic, 1.5 billion students stayed out of the school at least for 3 months. In some cases, half of the year. Here in Brazil, the situation is still very serious. What are the consequences for education in the world this crisis causes?
da pandemia. Como você disse, muitos não podem mais frequentar as escolas, principalmente as crianças que não sabem estudar sozinhas ou não contam com o apoio dos pais ou não têm acesso a aulas online. É um momento complicado, porque a escola não é somente um lugar para se aprender, é um ambiente social, principalmente para as crianças que podem não ter esse ambiente em casa. E para os jovens que já aprenderam a como aprender, que são autônomos, que já aprenderam muita coisa, isso pode ter sido uma experiência liberadora, mas vamos ver maiores disparidades no ambiente educacional.
Yes, we know that half of students in the world didn't have access to online education and during the pandemic. In Brazil, the number is even more dramatic. I think only 40% of the students have access to online education, or because they don't have connectivity, or because they have a proper device to study. This means that we are opening the gap, and this is a major preoccupation for everybody that works with education in Brazil. What can we do to close this gap? How can we approach this problem when we return in order
ou abordar este problema para termos um resultado menos ruim? Em primeiro lugar, eu reconheço esse desafio, mas eu vejo que os professores no Brasil estão muito comprometidos para fazerem o que puderem para chegar aos alunos, e eles usam o rádio, usam a televisão, e muitas vezes os professores se conectam aos alunos individuais, e eu vejo muito comprometimento dos professores. Mas, obviamente, quando as crianças voltarem à escola, os professores vão encontrar um mundo diferente. Alguns jovens terão experimentado algo muito bom na educação online, mas muitos estarão desconectados da escola. A realidade mudou. E para voltarem à escola, eu acho que vai ser um grande desafio. Os professores terão que reconhecer isso, que os alunos têm diferentes maneiras de aprender. Acho que será um grande teste para os professores se tornarem não somente bons instrutores, mas bons coaches, bons mentores, bons facilitadores, bons avaliadores. As exigências serão enormes. O ensino online não vai desaparecer. As escolas também no Brasil vão adotar o modelo híbrido, e o distanciamento social vai significar que as escolas não poderão funcionar com capacidade total. Portanto, as escolas terão que ser muito criativas para combinar o mundo virtual com o mundo real e trazer essas crianças de ambientes desfavorecidos. E muitas crianças não têm alternativas, portanto, há uma enorme responsabilidade em nível local. E essa não é um ponto forte da educação brasileira. As pessoas muitas vezes simplesmente obedecem ordens, mas agora deverão ser muito mais criativos, flexíveis e autônomos para responder a esse desafio. Sim, uma boa notícia é que estamos trabalhando com empresários e organizações civis. Há grandes movimentos no Brasil para influenciar as políticas públicas para universalização da internet. E acho que teremos uma lei de telecomunicação em breve no Brasil, cujo objetivo é conseguir essa universalização da internet no Brasil. Não sabemos quanto isso custaria ao país e estamos medindo, na verdade, o impacto da ausência de internet. Eu acho que seria um bom momento para influenciar os políticos e as políticas públicas para conseguirmos isso. Então, esse seria um bom resultado da pandemia. Em geral, este é o momento em que a educação se tornou um projeto da sociedade como um todo, e não apenas no Brasil. Em muitos países, não é mais o público versus o privado. Todos juntos, e vemos aí várias organizações da sociedade civil realmente tomando para si a responsabilidade de construir ambientes sociais para os alunos, de melhorar a tecnologia. A Colômbia, que uma das primeiras coisas que fizeram foi disponibilizar gratuitamente conteúdo escolar por telefones, por rádio. As crianças, então, recebiam educação gratuita. E isso, na verdade, não é muito caro, mas é uma coisa totalmente nova para os sistemas de ensino. E não se trata de dinheiro. A gente pensa na escola como um local e não como uma atividade. E pensamos no prédio da escola e não num mundo de aprendizagem. E, nesse momento, isso tem que se tornar um projeto da sociedade. Com certeza, nós lançamos uma campanha no Instituto Península com parceiros da educação para incentivar as pessoas a doar um segundo dispositivo. Muita gente tem vários computadores ou outros dispositivos dentro de casa que não utilizam, e essa é uma oportunidade aqui de falar desta campanha que lançamos. Eu posso aqui mostrar daqui a pouco o site do Educa Week para incentivar essa doação. Acho que é momento da sociedade se envolver. E o senhor está certo. Eu tenho visto uma resiliência no sistema educacional no Brasil. Eu vejo alguns pais agora valorizando mais os professores, porque perceberam que têm que educar as crianças em casa e estão sentindo aí o peso da dificuldade. E os professores estão sendo mais valorizados. Como o senhor vê o papel dos professores? Porque temos 2 milhões de professores no Brasil e muitos não tinham acesso à educação online. É a primeira vez que estão tendo que fazer isso, estão sendo muito criativos, muitos estão gerando conteúdo, estão pensando em novas maneiras de dar aulas online. Como o senhor acha que nós podemos promover esta proximidade com a tecnologia quando voltarmos à escola presencial? O que podemos fazer rapidamente para ajudar e apoiar os professores neste caminho? Bem, do lado positivo, de novo, o Brasil tem tido muito movimento aí por parte dos professores, muito mais do que nos anos anteriores. Então, eles estão tentando se familiarizar com as novas tecnologias. Isso é muito positivo. O que podemos ver é que, num ambiente onde a tecnologia amplifica as melhores práticas, os professores já estão prontos para adotá-las, mesmo aqueles que não tinham experiências anteriores. Se no futuro vocês quiserem que isso seja parte da prática, teremos que dar mais espaço aos professores para experimentarem nesses ambientes de ensino online. De forma geral, pelo menos é o que os resultados PISA mostram, o sistema de ensino brasileiro é muito prescritivo. Vocês têm aí um conteúdo bastante rígido, os professores são obrigados a cobrir esse conteúdo e raramente eles podem se envolver na geração do conteúdo. Eles têm pouco tempo fora da classe com outros professores para gerar conteúdo, para aprender melhores práticas, para fazer projetos relacionados à tecnologia. E existem sistemas de ensino muito rápidos, por exemplo, no Vietnã e na China, eles dão menos aulas, mas eles trabalham muito mais fora da aula, trabalhando com outros professores, não apenas aprendendo ou melhorando suas práticas educacionais, mas aprendendo sobre plataformas digitais. Por exemplo, há plataformas onde eles podem compartilhar seus planos de aula e comparar as suas métricas, e muitas vezes eles estão sempre criticando as práticas uns dos outros. E no final, o diretor, no final do ano, não vai perguntar: seus alunos aprenderam? Não, ele vai perguntar: qual foi a sua contribuição ao sistema de ensino geral, global? E esse é o problema com os professores brasileiros. Eles dão aulas demais e não têm tempo fora da sala de aula. E a última coisa que eu gostaria de dizer é que ensinar não é um processo transacional. ensinar é um processo relacional e é muito mais difícil isso do que a tecnologia. Muitos professores são capazes de usar a tecnologia, mas nesse momento você precisa chegar a cada um dos seus alunos. Eles não estão mais lá na sala de aula, na sua frente. Você tem que ir atrás deles, você tem que encontrá-los e conhecer os seus sonhos e aspirações e suportá-los e dar apoio a eles. Eu acho que é isso que os professores têm que fazer no momento. E eu vejo muitos professores pensando em como dar aulas, em como montar o processo de ensino. E pensar sobre o processo é uma coisa muito produtiva, os resultados são melhores, e é um resultado da crise também. Uma outra pergunta sobre a evasão escolar. Eu tenho trabalhado com algumas pessoas
The schools drop after the crisis. We have
nós
some students that has already declared, around 30% of the students of high school declare already that they are not intend to come back to school because they need to help their families, because they need to generate
não vão
they need to gain money.
família, querem ganhar
A big worry about many secretaries of education in Brazil.
uma grande
What is your
para os
suggestions for address this problem?
suas sugestões.
I think it's a very difficult challenge, but not just one for the short term, also for the long run. You know,
Mas não
if you would
no longo
run a
prazo.
supermarket, not a
Se você gerenciasse um supermercado, não uma escola, e descobrisse que de 100 clientes, 30 saem sem comprar nada, e isso acontece toda semana, mês, você começaria a mudar o seu estoque. A gente não fez isso na educação. E o motivo por que os alunos vão embora, sim, eles precisam ajudar suas famílias, mas por outro lado, é que o que eles aprendem não lhes parece relevante para a vida. E eu acho que este é o grande desafio para a educação no Brasil, ir além dos resultados cognitivos, ter também aprendizagem social, emocional, coisas que os alunos realmente valorizem. Eu acho que a resposta de curto prazo é encontre seus alunos e traga-os de volta para a escola, isso é importante. Mas para o longo prazo, o ensino tem que ser mais relevante para um maior número de pessoas. Eu acho que no Brasil vocês estão muito voltados ao sucesso acadêmico para entrar na universidade, e esse não é o único destino possível. E eu acho que o sistema de ensino não leva isso em conta. Eu tenho uma pergunta aqui. A professora Raquel, do Brasil, pede se o senhor poderia nos dar uma sugestão. Qual seria a coisa mais importante que o Brasil deveria fazer para melhorar o ensino público? Como professor, seria realmente mudar o âmbito do ensino. Eu acho que os alunos aprendem coisas demais superficialmente. Se quiser mudar, realmente uma mudança de longo prazo, seria ensinar menos coisas com maior profundidade. Não ensine tudo na matemática, mas ensine as pessoas a pensar de forma matemática. Então, não ensine tanta ciência, mas ensine como pensar como cientista e quais são as questões que podem ser investigadas cientificamente. Eu acho que vocês no Brasil poderiam realmente ter um grande sucesso se vocês liberassem o currículo e reduzissem as ideias essenciais. Será que eu posso complementar aqui, acrescentando mais um ponto? Você teve a chance de ver a nossa orientação do currículo. Nós lançamos em 2018 a nova orientação para o currículo. Você acha que esta nova base curricular significa uma melhoria ou não foi na direção certa? Eu gosto dessa base curricular, porque oferece uma orientação e os professores utilizavam livros, não é, que são muito abrangentes. E com a base curricular, vocês isolam os aspectos mais essenciais, mas mesmo assim, como professor, você precisa ter um discernimento. O que é importante para a minha sala de aula hoje, para os meus alunos? Se eu for a uma aula de matemática e eu vou ver mais ou menos 17 pontos sendo apresentados. Na China, eu veria no máximo 1 ponto sendo apresentado, e isso é o que eu estou dizendo. Essa base curricular realmente oferece uma base, mas os professores sofrem muita pressão para ensinarem coisas demais. Nossa, eu concordo 100%. Na sua visão, qual deveria ser a nossa prioridade quando voltarmos à escola presencial em setembro? O que você acha que a gente devia enfocar? Nós sabemos que este processo gera muita ansiedade e estresse, não somente para as crianças, mas para os professores e todo o sistema, até os pais, né? Qual deveria ser o nosso foco quando voltarmos? Por exemplo, o que um diretor de escola deveria enfocar, ou um secretário de educação? Bem, em primeiro lugar, dê apoio às pessoas. Nós temos várias pesquisas mostrando que não é nas escolas que as pessoas se infectam. Na verdade, a escola é um local seguro e poderiam introduzir algum distanciamento, mas as escolas podem ser locais bem seguros e a prioridade tem que ser encontrar aqueles alunos que sofreram mais com a crise e que eles possam receber um apoio maior para eles chegarem ao nível de todos. Se a escola só puder acomodar 60% ou 50% dos alunos, deveriam ser aqueles alunos que ficaram mais atrasados, que precisam mais de um auxílio individual, pode ser que sejam os mais jovens ou aqueles que não tiveram acesso a ensino remoto, e eu acho que esses alunos têm que ter a prioridade na oportunidade. E comunicar que a escola há muitos fake news,
About, when do I need to give special support to a teacher? When do I need a quarantine arrangement for a teacher?
Não acho nós temos muitas países que já abrir abertura, exemplos no mundo. Que países o senhor citaria como bons exemplos para o Brasil? Os países asiáticos, Vietnã, bem, professor próximo.
If you know only your subject and how students learn that subject, but you do not know your students really well, you're going to have a hard time in reopening your classroom. So that's very, very important. If you look to Europe, some European countries like Sweden never closed schools. They said, well, we close everything, but we don't want to close schools because that is the foundation of our society. And they have tried to make schools safe places. We can learn a lot from that experience. My own country, Germany, has got very well back on track as well. So I think, yeah, around the world, you find, I think, many countries that are well advanced on that track.
Avançados nessa questão. Eu tenho uma questão aqui, uma pergunta da Maria do Rosário. Ela está dizendo que a tecnologia está revolucionando o ensino. como fazer com que os alunos realmente se engajem. Posso? Bem, há alunos que têm um perfil muito fácil para se engajar. Como lidar com esses dois perfis? A gente faz a mesma pergunta dos professores. A tecnologia nunca vai funcionar se os professores ou alunos forem somente consumidores. A tecnologia só vai funcionar se os professores e alunos estiverem ativamente envolvidos nas soluções, sim, criar espaços nas escolas onde os alunos possam participar, onde o desenvolvimento desses cursos online os torne co-criadores num ambiente criativo. Na verdade, vemos que os alunos gostam de participar de várias maneiras, e a mesma coisa vale para os professores. Dê aos professores tempo, espaço e apoio para que participem na geração do conteúdo e teremos um ambiente bem diferente. Novamente, eu estou dizendo simplesmente do que vejo em outros países. Vocês ficarão surpresos quanto dos seus professores vão se tornar especialistas em tecnologia rapidamente, porque não estamos falando de tecnologia, mas de tomar o controle. Quanto tempo ainda temos, Marcos? Bem, eu preciso sair em menos de 6 minutos. Última pergunta. A sociedade está passando por uma grande transformação. Estamos aprendendo muito sobre novos processos. O desemprego que era já um grande problema, com proporções gigantescas. A pergunta é, como lidar com as escolas?
To address this new world, how can we prepare our students to deal with this new world?
Para lidar com este novo mundo que está aparecendo por causa do coronavírus. As escolas são muito boas em manter os alunos confinados com isso não é bom. Nós temos que construir pontos para trazer paz para a escola. Há muitas maneiras de fazer. Quando as crianças crescem com um bom entendimento do mundo como um todo, é que podemos educá-los para o futuro. O ensino brasileiro está muito focado em sucesso acadêmico. O mundo é muito maior do que isso. Num sistema de mundo real, as pessoas têm que saber lidar com tudo. Eu vejo muitas crianças no Brasil que não gostam de ciência, principalmente se vêm de locais desfavorecidos. Pode ser que elas nunca tenham encontrado um cientista ou nunca tenham tido uma prática na ciência. Se isso fosse introduzido mais cedo em suas vidas, seria diferente. E depois as crianças, os jovens têm que ter acesso a estágios, isso é muito importante. Muito bom. Muito obrigado, Andrés. Eu aprendi muito, foi uma super aula, muito obrigada por seu tempo, e foi um conteúdo muito importante para discutirmos com o público. Andréas, muito obrigado por estar conosco hoje de manhã. Para o Brasil é uma honra tê-lo aqui no Educa Week 2020. Gostaria de pedir uma última mensagem para o Brasil. Neste momento difícil da pandemia, é aqui que temos que nos perguntar que tipo de educação nós queremos dar aos alunos para o futuro. Apesar de todos os desafios, nós vemos tantos professores no Brasil tomando essa iniciativa, construindo ambientes locais, isso me faz ser otimista que o Brasil vai conseguir fazer essa transição. Há muita gente assumindo responsabilidades pelo ensino, por seus alunos. Portanto, eu acho que existe aí uma luz no final do túnel, que vocês estão no caminho certo. Muito obrigado. Muito obrigado, Ana Maria Diniz, senhor André Schleicher. Obrigado a todos, obrigado por nos assistir. Grande prazer.